All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Crypto with English. I have the very distinct honor of introducing two very well-accomplished leaders and entrepreneurs in this space. I'd like to welcome the founder and CEO of ConsenSys Health, Leigh Flannery, and the Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Sean Manion. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. And I want to preface this episode as such. Often when it comes to blockchain, you hear about the price movement of Bitcoin, you hear about meme coins all the time, and the unique tweets and I think movements of whales that are doing X, Y, and Z in this space. One of the most understated yet most important parts of this space, especially over the next 5 to 10 years, is healthcare and blockchain. And when people talk about blockchain and cryptocurrency essentially as being the survival of, let's say, the global financial system, the economy, well, what is more central to survival than our actual healthcare? And on top of that, what if we add blockchain to that? Given the multitude of problems with the global financial system and with the lockdowns, blockchain may be the vehicle that is going to essentially decentralize our society forward. And with what's going on and what will be going on in healthcare and in biotech, we're going to get into the weeds of some of that today. So again, I warmly welcome you both coming onto the show today.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thrilled to be here.
Agreed. Very, very happy to be here. I think we're going to have a fun conversation.
Awesome. One of the main points and objectives of this live stream is to increase awareness, palpability, and just overall accessibility of blockchain. I've made this joke a few times on prior episodes, but if I was in the middle of Times Square right now and I was trying to give out Ethereum in blockchain, 9 out of 10 people would be very wary of that. So we have many projects and use cases in this space. And given the problems of today, healthcare and people's health, period, is one of the most poignant issues that we are all facing today. I was wondering if you could tell all of us about ConsenSys and ConsenSys Health from a bird's eye view.
Sure, I'll be glad to start that off, and maybe I'll provide a little bit of the backstory on ConsenSys, and maybe Sean, you can pick up with some of our core strategies at ConsenSys Health. So, ConsenSys, for those of you who aren't familiar, is founded by one of Ethereum's inventors, Mr. Joe Lubin. And shortly after the launch of the Ethereum mainnet and the radical appreciation of the crypto asset ETH, Mr. Lubin took a lot of his earnings and began a process of investing in a private for-profit company with the mission of bringing enterprise-grade scalability to the use of the Ethereum mainnet and enterprise Ethereum in private context as well. That began in 2014. And today, ConsenSys is one of the world's leaders in the field of decentralized finance, all things NFTs, the creation of the Hyperledger Besu protocol, the new administrator and code base owner for ConsenSys, what is now ConsenSys Quorum as a blockchain protocol, the Microsoft relationship with the Azure blockchain service becoming the ConsenSys Quorum blockchain service. These are all evolutions going on through ConsenSys. And we're just incredibly honored by our affiliation with ConsenSys and our ongoing relationship. Joe Lubin's a member of our board of directors and an investor in ConsenSys Health. And I'll turn it over to Sean to describe how, after we spun off from ConsenSys as a commercially independent entity, how have we evolved some of our thinking about the unique needs of healthcare and life sciences?
Thank you, and yeah, that is good timing, as Heather was working hard with ConsenSys, and as CEO and founder of ConsenSys Health was the one who talked with Joe Lubin and convinced him that healthcare was different enough that an independent spinoff was necessary, though with a tight relationship with ConsenSys. I came on when that spinoff occurred. I had spent 20 years in academia and federal research, clinical research, and basic research. I understood the problems in science and the problems underlying medical evidence, and moving forward quickly the knowledge translation into improved health outcomes. We like to call it faster miracles or faster medical miracles. So in March of 2020, when Heather spun off ConsenSys Health, I joined along with a number of others, and some came from ConsenSys, including the core of our tech team. We view healthcare as being perhaps a maybe not a bigger challenge, but a different challenge than some other areas like fintech. And so blockchain is necessary, but not sufficient to do many of the things that are required. Healthcare is different from a regulatory standpoint. It's different from a data standpoint. The standardization or cleanliness of data just isn't there compared to other industries. And it's different from a cultural standpoint. What risk tolerance is there? What the risk-averse nature of it is kind of embedded into the system. So to tackle that, we've looked at some other families of technology in addition to blockchain, and that's decentralized AI, or a federated learning or federated compute approach to how data is handled and managed, or really how data can stay safely at rest while algorithms or analytics can be deployed to the data. And then, of course, in healthcare, you can't do anything without privacy. And there's laws and regulations, not simply a nice to have, but a must have. And so we use a family of confidential computing or privacy in depth hardware and software solutions, zero knowledge proof, homomorphic encryption, to apply the technological trust or the technological privacy preserving aspects to the function of that decentralized AI, that federated learning, with a blockchain layer that serves both as a foundational audit layer for trust and transparency, but also, as everyone from crypto knows, an incentivization layer that can be brought to bear as well. And that's sort of, in summary, kind of our overall focus on how healthcare can be transformed with blockchain and other associated emerging technologies.
Well summarized. And speaking of which, what are those unique problems that, let's say, a blockchain startup, mid-sized company will be facing as far as assembling and organizing all these projects in healthcare? Whereas, how would these problems be different than let's say, a supply chain based type of company, or let's say a fintech based company? And also, I mean, just off the bat, from what I know, there are issues with, let's say, data and privacy and regulation, state and federal. So if we could probably outline some of that, what would be some of those unique problems?
Sure. I think, Adam, to begin with, in healthcare and life sciences, it's really all about the data. And a first principle when we're intersecting our industry with blockchain, and just to clarify for the audience, we're not talking about persisting healthcare medical information or even identifying information on chain. What we're really talking about is needing to abstract up out of the enterprise IT departments of healthcare and life sciences companies and public health, et cetera, into a new class of infrastructure, the ability to federate health information analytically for learning purposes, to achieve privacy preserving data liquidity. If this is different and distinct from other industries, all industries that deal with physical goods have supply chain considerations, but they don't all house absolutely massive and growing data sets that are
Right.
strategically mission critical and imperative, life and death for humans and life and death for the corporations that house that information and seek to monetize it through new drug discovery, for example. So we're talking about untold volumes of extremely critical information that is growing so rapidly that it exceeds really our ability to imagine and understand how rapidly the size of this data is growing. I'm talking about the expansion of 5G, the rolling out of sensor tech at the edge, every single thing in our lives becoming connected devices, many of which are providing health relevant information. So we've reached already a logistic extreme of this idea of data lakes. But generally, our industry has been progressing by thinking, I know, here's what we can do. We'll create an ever bigger data lake and then use that as training data for AIs. But we're talking about a data lake that is long since flooded and exceeded
Right.
all of its borders and is flooding faster and faster and faster. And that means at its core that we have to move to what we call federated first architectures. So that implies that right now, for any workflows to flow, whether they are clinical or business or scientific, today, some piece of information has to move from system A to system B in order for it to be computed upon. And this is for routine administrative transactions, not just machine learning, any transaction.
Right.
We believe that is a sunsetting paradigm. It has to be a sunsetting paradigm because of the flooding of all data lakes and the
Right.
intrinsic limitations on the privacy and compliance and even bioethical implications of those data lakes. So we're moving our industry to a world where the exchange of health information will become an exception case, like the federation of health information is an exception case today. So we are going to invert it where most workflows can flow and most analytics can occur without ever having to centralize the data.
Wow.
Sean? Oh, sorry, Adam, go ahead.
I was just going to state, so it would be fair to say the current legacy systems in place right now in healthcare, in life sciences, are really no longer serving doctors. They're really no longer serving patients or any other parties within this ecosystem.
Well, I would be cautious in that statement, and I'm sorry to cut you off, Sean, and I'll let you pick up on this. I want to assert that the visionary and committed leaders across every stakeholder group in healthcare and life sciences, whether we're talking about leaders from pharmaceutical companies, from health insurance companies, from provider organizations, from the public sector, all of these groups are working incredibly hard to solve these data problems and to solve emergent healthcare issues with the reality we live in today. So I wouldn't say that no one is being served. I would say that no stakeholder group is satisfied with the status quo, including patients.
Right.
Sean, sorry, what were you going to say?
I kind of building on that and trying to set up an analogy. I feel like we've, in healthcare, we've transferred from horse and buggy into cars, into flying cars, but we're still requiring everyone stay on the same dirt roads. And there's a limitation to the structure that we can't quite get out of to get the full advantage of these current families of emerging technologies that are transforming other industries as we speak. And I think to do that, we need to think a little bit differently, but we need to think differently in a way that satisfies the regulatory challenges, the we can't kill patients challenges. I'll be quite blunt. There's a risk level that just doesn't exist in other places directly tied to we're going to transform healthcare in here. Well, if you start to have people who are dying of things that wouldn't have died, you've just failed. And so you need to anticipate all those problems, do that entire risk analysis before you ever hit the ground running. And that's something that's well beyond the capacity of really a whole lot of small and even medium-sized businesses. And so it takes a visionary view of the future, a detailed understanding of the current status, and then the right anchoring of partnerships and multiple emerging technologies tied to the legacy systems to merge in a phase-wise way beyond that, but have everybody comfortable with what that path looks like. That's one of the biggest challenges, I think, right now. And so, moving, as Heather said, beyond, it's not so much that the current system isn't working for doctors or nurses or administrators. It's that they're working within constraints that maybe can be removed, but take a very complex picture to remove it, not we'll just snap our fingers and throw some new technology on it and everything will be fine.
Right. And by the way, Heather, I did not mean that as a loaded question. In fact, I think, Sean, you actually articulated the point I was actually trying to get at, in that it seems like whatever is in place, there is room for improvement, and perhaps room for some sort of structural upgrade to better make this an easier process and a more efficient and really a more holistically effective system for everybody. You know, I was looking at ConsenSys, I was looking at the website, and I was looking at ConsenSys Health, and something that popped into my head is there some sort of general statistic or number, let's say, as far as money and time lost per year based on some of these issues regarding, let's say, data lakes, for instance, based on some of these other, I guess you could say, current structural issues that we've been discussing?
Well, yes, there are lots of statistics about area issues along these lines, though I'm loath to quote any unless I have the citation at
Sure.
hand immediately. But one I will say is that waste, fraud, and abuse in healthcare and life sciences has been reported to account for. I've seen studies that go between 15 cents and 35 cents of every dollar spent
Oh, wow.
in the U.S. healthcare system, considering that the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services alone provide $3.4 trillion a year in expenditure just out of that particular track. We're talking about an enormous amount in waste, fraud, and abuse. Also, data problems are purportedly at the heart of medical errors generally at this point. Medical errors are often attributed to difficulties moving between paper, which are still used heavily, lots of paper, lots of fax, and a wide range of IT systems across every stakeholder group in the industry. So there's a belief that improving this data efficiency should be able to help reduce medical errors. Proving that is a really interesting proposition. Sean, what would you like to add?
I'll take the more futuristic look. Heather and rightly so, as our CEO, has a very good granular understanding of the business and the health and the technical side. I come from a research background where I kind of she lets me look forward 10 to 20 years and say, oh, we're going to do this, and it aligns with her vision too. So that's why we get along really well. But I view the 17 years it takes to come up with an idea for how to treat people better, and then get that into practice, what's sometimes called bench to bedside. That currently on average takes 17 years. That's an opportunity cost that's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
People die waiting for solutions to come online for things that we haven't yet figured out how to treat yet, but we have ideas and we can't move them through the pipeline of knowledge translation fast enough. I think that can be sped up 10,000 times, and we are working on pieces of that. That's not a, hey, we're going to do this tomorrow, but I think that could be done in a decade with the right partnerships and some of the technologies we're bringing to bear. And we're setting up a roadmap of that. We've pulled together a public-private partnership to scope out that roadmap of that very long-term vision. But beyond the immediate costs available, or the immediate costs and improvements that can be saved, I think there are long-term benefits to looking at capacity building across the systems of healthcare, of research, and many institutions that tie into those. And that's what we hope to bring to bear. If you can give people short-term value for exploring these solutions, and then show them how long-term investment in building capacity can also have additional levels of value on that 10,000 times faster degree, that's where you can get some truly transformational aspects.
Well put. And when putting this project together, ConsenSys Health, what pushback or critiques have either of you faced? You know, ranging from whether some people say, well, blockchain is a very energy intensive process, it's bad for the environment, which is a very common argument that is, you know, circulated, and it does have its issues. And on the other hand, have some people, you know, posited to you, maybe this is a little too ambitious for this point in time, given the amount of, I guess you could say, regulatory red tape you have to go through, you know, getting other people within the industry, you know, in sync with this idea, things like that. This question is more in line with, I guess you could say, the entrepreneur's journey, but I love hearing stories about that, and especially the audience loves hearing stories about that.
You know what, Adam, in response to that, I think I'd like to ask Sean to first take that.
Okay.
He has a particular way of talking about incrementalism that is so resonant for me, and then I'm going to pile on.
Okay.
Sean,
Sounds good.
You go.
Fair enough. And I, I appreciate the need to take safe baby steps. But something I've been thinking about a lot recently is that you can't necessarily only ever take baby steps and expect to finish a marathon in this lifetime. I posted something on LinkedIn yesterday about is a steady diet of low hanging fruit just a recipe for innovation malnutrition, because you end up with low hanging fruit and easy steps and individualized steps never really getting you anywhere. And given the cycles that we work in business and in government and in academia, oftentimes you have administration overhauls and changes in vision and everything in a 3 to 5 year time frame. And if all you've achieved in those 3 to 5 years is testing your footing, and then you spin around 180, you're not going to get anywhere. And so I think being able to tackle some of those regulatory challenges, business challenges, scientific challenges, clinical validation challenges, and of course the technical challenges, all in concert together in a relatively reasonable time frame, 3 to 5 years, towards one big goal, and then moving that into the next big goal, really is required. And it's not easy work, but that's nothing worthwhile is ever easy. And so I think some of that is absolutely critical, to think big and to plan to do things big. And let's be honest, there's a risk with that. There's a risk of failure. And if you're afraid of failure, you're probably better off only sticking with the incrementalism. And there's no loss in it. There's value in incrementalism in a lot of ways, but without that transformational movement as well, we're not going to get ahead as a large group society. So some folks have to take the risk. And I think we and many of our partners are willing to do that because we see the value.
Wonderfully put.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more passionately. I think, to answer your question, I'll add to what Sean was saying by expressing that even before we really got started as a company, the immediate questions we always receive is, where is this working today in production? I don't want to hear any of this visionary, imaginary sci-fi stuff. I want to hear only about things that are already over. They're done. They're happening. Tell me about those things. And that's been a continuous challenge, where we are trying to affect major structural change in a highly complex industry, massively regulated industry, upon which the life of every human being on Earth quite literally depends. There is a burden of change. What does it take to change an industry that cannot afford any risk because people could die? It's no joke. It's not that anyone's doing something wrong by being conservative and risk adverse. I mean, imagine every single one of us is a patient. It's no time to be messing around with things that might not work, that could cause problems. Every single one of us has life and death implications for ourselves, our loved ones, our family members, and our communities. So this risk aversion is a built-in feature. It's not a bug. And in order to get through a cognitive and operational burden of change that can accommodate that kind of risk to human life, you better have much more than other industries have in order to concretize that value. So in general, like in the venture capital world, they talk about a 10x improvement over baseline. We don't want any of this incremental 1 or 2x. We need 10x. It has to be 10 times better in order to get past the general human inertia and resistance to change in bureaucracies, from an industrial psych perspective. I would suggest that in our industry, in healthcare and life sciences, where there are so many concrete and urgent reasons to be very concerned about change, we don't need 10x over baseline. We need massive, audacious, radical improvement over baseline, radical, in order to warrant and accommodate change. Like, for example, we talk about in our industry, there are 3 entire subsets of our industry that today operate with different economics, different regulatory environments, and different IT infrastructures and data platforms. And those are public health, medicine, the delivery of medicine, and clinical research. all three are working with effectively the same data, but always transformed and copied and changed and moved versions of effectively the same data under completely disparate governance models and regulatory frameworks. All of this evolved, these three separate worlds inside healthcare. They evolved because of the compliance dimensions put in place. These are evolutions around all of our privacy and other healthcare specific regulations. What if all of the technology that facilitated privacy is now completely different? I mean, it all made sense when those laws were written, but it
Right.
was written against a completely aged technological paradigm. Well, it means that we're ripe for a 1000x, a 10,000x improvement in efficiency as a result of structural change. And we think that instead of constantly being focused on the quote unquote low hanging fruit, the small incremental gains, we suggest even if you could make those gains, they're not enough to inspire transformation. And,
Right.
and that's why we take the position we do, but it's not really a popular position, to be frank. Everyone wants the easy and the fast and the proven now.
Very much so.
And if I could add one more thing
Yes.
to that, because something
Yes, by
you
all
mentioned
means.
early on, the regulatory portion to it is and as Heather noted, is there as a necessary piece to minimize the risk. And so some of the risk that people are anticipating is based on that regulatory or legacy regulatory evaluation. And part of the way of getting past that is actually helping the regulators understand that this is lowering the risk. Some of these technologies, it is absolutely reducing it. There's a I'll put it bluntly. There's a fear of regulators, and maybe a slightly unnatural fear of regulators amongst most people in research and in clinical care. And I think that translates into many of the business processes, and people just view them as an adversary to be figured out how to battle. But really, if you embrace the regulators and help them understand that these transformative technologies give them what they're looking for with an even higher degree of speed and granularity and quality. The example being in clinical research, you have regulators under Health and Human Services, Office of Civil Rights, and local institutional review boards in the United States who have to do audits of clinical research activities going on to make sure things are meeting the regulatory. This is always or almost very frequently an antagonistic relationship and relies on compliance and oftentimes self-report by the researchers themselves. If you put a blockchain layer underlying the data collection within a clinical research system that the researchers themselves and the regulators had access to and relied upon provenance of data with automated trust, all of a sudden everyone's life is easier, the function is cheaper, and it can be trusted more. And everyone moves forward more successfully. But there's a hesitancy to get everybody on the same page and work together. And that hesitancy is actually one of the barriers. So sometimes it's a anticipated risk rather than actual risk that is slowing down the progress.
Well put. And my next question goes in line with what both of you said. What were some of the successes that you both have experienced when putting this project together, where despite these overwhelming hurdles and obstacles, what events happened where you thought, okay, this can really work?
I'm thinking so I'll bring up one and I'd love for you to continue with this, Sean. So during the pandemic, we were, one of the first things we felt was how unfortunate it was that we've been delayed in the adoption of this technology in our industry, and how radically different real-time, real-world evidence and real-time global analytics would be if we were on the other side of the transformation we're describing. And of course, pandemic response is only one of many, many equally vital scenarios. But we have a very close partnership with Intel Health and Life Sciences, and they launched the Intel Pandemic Response Initiative. And in that, we collaborated. We had been doing joint research and development with Intel on the Ice Lake generation of their SGX offering, which is a confidential computing offering connected to their chips, a hardware trusted enclaves. And so we took that work, and under a grant from Intel Health and Life Sciences through their Pandemic Technology Response Initiative, we were able to validate our technical hypothesis about how we could do matching for clinical trials in a way that completely preserved the privacy of the patient being matched to the trials. And just to take a quick step back up from what that means, many clinical trials that are multi-site will go through all the administrative work and the expense of setting up a site for a trial, only to then be unable to recruit participants into the trial. And patients with disease with various diseases and conditions often are not given the opportunity to participate in research or even made aware that there are studies going on that could affect their disease state or condition. So, but the blockers to this are really about where the data lives and who has access to it, and what privacy laws pertain to that data and who is authorized to run queries like that. So I'll let Sean continue with this story, but it was an incredibly exciting to be able to work with Intel in proving out our very particular use of this confidential computing technology.
That's awesome.
Sean?
And that is one of the early successes that we've seen in not just taking our concepts, but taking that into a real world application with partners, ironing out the details that you just don't get on paper, especially with merging these technologies, not just blockchain, which are, our parent company have been hardening that in finance and other industries for years, and we've gotten a good feel for what works and doesn't work in that part of the technology, but how it combines with some of the confidential computing and the hardware solution that Intel had, as well as some of the federated AI is where the next level of complexity. So we've made progress there, and we continue to make progress in those incremental ways that we need to show this transformational vision. But I want to take almost a step back into one of the first things, and blockchain it's a technology application, but it is more than that. It has aspects to it that are people related and trust related, and there are things that you cannot achieve large levels of success without working with other people. And I think that trust in just understanding that this technology is one that can be used for positive things, one that can be transformational, is something that was slow to adopt beyond the early adopters, the 1% to 2% who have really been excited about it for a few years. I got to see that firsthand. Less than 5 years ago, I was working for the federal government as a federal civilian research administrator, and I learned about these technologies, and I was trying to say, hey, we should look at them, and there was a high amount of hesitancy. I understate that a little bit. I've written some things on that. I got a lot of pushback. People said, we don't want to hear about this crazy blockchain stuff, and get the Star Trek stuff out of here. And that's fine. You're not always going to get innovation in the federal government, and that especially at that time. What happened with COVID was in the healthcare scene, the old adage that when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the second best time to plant a tree? Today. Well, COVID showed us we should have planted this tree 20 years ago, and we simply didn't. And we are humans. We do have a short attention span, and we forget things, but there are enough people in enough high-level positions in government, in industry, across healthcare, across technology said, oh, wow, we needed to be looking at this innovation a lot more deeply, a lot sooner. And it's not just blockchain; it's a variety of emerging techs. And I think Heather and I both independently, but together as at ConsenSys Health, we've had the experience where a whole lot of people who weren't paying attention, or yeah, that's nice, Sean, come back to next year, all of a sudden picked up the phone and said, hey, what's this stuff and how do we get on board? And that's one of the major transformational things that has occurred in these past 2 years, is that people realize just what a problem it is if you don't have these capacities in place, how you can't just sit back and wait for them to magically transform somewhere, especially because there's a challenge in increasing the amount of trust in between institutions that are only getting experimented on and piloted within single institutions. And that's where people aren't realizing the full value. And I think one of the things we can explore a little bit more as we move on today, and Heather speaks to this because she's really thought through the problem set in a big way, is that you need to get the right parties together that normally wouldn't work with each other at the pilot level, at the early level, and at the transformational level, rather than try and do this in silos. breaking down the silos of not just data, but of trust is one of the major milestones that needs to be achieved in making these technologies work for healthcare and life sciences.
Well put. So would it be fair to say, given the advent of COVID-19, the lockdowns, this pandemic that we're still navigating through, did this really expose and reveal the cracks in the foundation that have really been under the surface and under the fog for, let's say, these 20 plus years, as you had mentioned? It seems to me this might have been a catalyst as far as awareness. This really seemed to be a huge sudden wake-up call, front and center, almost immediately, and with all the shock and awe that maybe one might, essentially experience in maybe, let's say, a battle or some sort of very stressful situation. Because that's what it looked like to me. If I was to turn on the news, watch anything, all of these problems that we essentially have in different parts and different sectors of our society have now been exposed and are now on the plate in front of us. And this isn't just, let's say, government officials or think tanks being aware of this. This is now the average citizen on the street now having some level of consciousness about these things.
I think you're absolutely right, Adam. The distinction is professionals in our industry have long been aware of these challenges and have been writing about them and studying how to solve them and creating policy interventions about them for a long, long time. The distinction is now the cultural tipping point of being unwilling to tolerate the status quo any longer.
Well put,
we have normalized these problems. Everyone complains about having to fill out the same paperwork over and over again with a pen on a clipboard, and all of the negative experiences we have as patients. But the other thing that happened over the course of the pandemic was the escalating awareness of social injustices in the U.S. that were interconnected with health disparities, radical health disparities affecting vulnerable populations in a massively disproportionate way. That happened through the pandemic. The economic implications, the healthcare implications were massive. So the change in the ability to tolerate dysfunction in an inefficiency and high cybersecurity risk, poor inclusiveness of the population in healthcare was paired with an overall culturally broad and deep willingness to tolerate systemic social injustices any longer as well. So our implications for what we can do from a health data perspective, for example, by helping to remove bias from the data that is used to train AIs that are now part of all of our healthcare, is equally important in healthcare as it is in social justice. And the unity of those themes all hit at the same time, and now we are finally moving out of a state where only wonks in healthcare and life sciences talk about and worry about these problems, which were nothing new and were well understood by professionals who just made it their job to manage these problems.
Right.
Now all of society is saying enough's enough. And we've focused at ConsenSys Health on first principles like identity. You can't deal with making data self-sovereign if you have not established a self-sovereign identity. You can't deal with providing fine-grained, blockchain verifiable consents to use or exchange that data, that self-sovereign data, without having gone backward up the chain to who is this person? Do we know that this entity expressing this thing is actually the entity who occupies that meat suit? And what does that mean?
Right.
So this chain from self-sovereign identity, enabling self-sovereign data, enabling fine-grained consent over the use and exchange of that data, and ultimately enabling the use of artificial intelligences that can be trusted by the individual as having no conflict of interest. Right now, we are subject to artificial intelligences that are organized by governments and corporations and affect us as individuals in so many ways, but there's a radical power asymmetry. We have no counter for those powers. In the future that we're seeking to envision, self-sovereign AI will become something real and trusted because every piece of data all the way backward in the chain and the identity that consented to it is all verifiable.
Beautifully put. And, this made me think of something from the point you just raised. Solving and addressing societal problems as far as vulnerable populations. So let's say if I was to give you a microcosm and like kind of a macrocosm example, like let's say if hypothetically myself, I take a vacation, I go across the country and let's say I go to Hawaii or something like that. Let's say I break my leg. I have to go to a hospital. Maybe then I'll see a general practitioner and then a specialist. Along that way, and let's say providing my information, let's say given the state of, let's say, pain or discomfort, I may not be giving the same information or same degree of accuracy to each doctor and each medical staff member that I interact with along the way. So, and also because there's really no, I guess you could say, source where everybody can pull the same information from in some sort of efficient way. That might lead to errors, if inefficiencies, that might lead to delays, that might lead to issues in, let's say, the way hypothetically my leg would be treated in that scenario. And then addressing major societal problems, if there's a part of the country that is really receiving deficient medical services for particularly vulnerable populations, something on a blockchain like this with, let's say, records that are immutable, unalterable, and essentially in a place that has the ease of access where you can really make these split-second, consistent, well-thought-out decisions, you can probably tell from that medical data this community is not receiving the resources that they really should be. Are they underfunded? Is there something else going on? Is there a lack of public transportation? So you mentioning that point really made me think of a lot of these things right now, like the high quality of data that one can put into the system and maintain. You could really figure out these social problems really from numbers alone. So let's say if it was the issue in Flint, Michigan a few years ago with the high levels of lead in the water and people essentially being, brought into hospitals en masse, children, elderly, across the spectrum, that might be ascertained from data on a system such as yours versus parsing through, let's say, doctor's notes, not per se doctor's notes, but if you were to go through medical reports from so many different sources, that really destroys efficiency. That really could damage the ability to really make those life and death decisions or even act upon those life and death situations in really the best way possible. I am very, very excited. But anyway, I'm sorry, continue. You got the gears turning in my head right now.
What you're describing, Adam, in healthcare, they refer to as person-centeredness. And it's been held up as a value of our industry. Everyone agrees from all sectors of the healthcare and life sciences industry that person-centeredness is needed and is necessary. And only the individual in the center of all of their processes and their families are in a position to curate all of that information or govern its accessibility or use. Everyone understands that in the abstract, but achieving that in practice has had major, major barriers that we're working hard to overcome. But that's the phrase that is used in our industry to describe just what you said, person-centeredness. And right now, there is no infrastructure for the person. There is not a regulatory wrapper with sufficient clarity, though it has made huge leaps forward in the US market in recent times with the 21st Century Cures Act and the investigation and enforcement provisions for something called information blocking has now gone into effect. And I don't know if we want to talk about that on this episode, but information blocking has a lot to do with why ConsenSys Health and organizations like us and our partners,
by all means,
are going to be able to do things differently now in the U.S. market than has happened historically. Sean, you want to frame that up about what is this new illegal action called information blocking?
Well, the ability of an individual to request and receive their information, their healthcare information, is now something that's being enforced is probably a heavy term, but at least backed by law, that they are allowed to do this. It's always been there, but there hasn't been enough detail with regard to HIPAA and the ability that I have to access my information to enforce that in any way. And so you have companies that have ways of keeping that from happening. Oh, we own this, we have this, now with that changing with respect to the laws that Heather is referencing, we've envisioned our technology applications being able to be built around that empowered patient or that empowered individual, to not just have the patient be the center of their healthcare, but be in control of it and have a self-sovereign role in it, and quite possibly in the economics that we envision, be compensated for that. If someone wants to use my information to make a drug and make money off of that, I should have the option of making sure that my contribution to that in the form of my data is something that I get remunerated for. The system we have for that, our combination of technologies, blockchain combined with decentralized AI or federated learning, and then those confidential compute or those privacy and depth components, we call elevated compute. And that is the engine that runs what we envision the data architecture of the future as being data integrity and learning networks. The integrity from the blockchain, the learning networks from the AI, underwritten by this confidential computing. And so if the patients are able to access all of their data, or permit access to all of their data where it sits through these systems, they are enabled to walk into a hospital in Florida or walk into a specialist clinic if they're visiting Montana, and have the same amount of information about them be available. And that can be electronic health record information, but that can be a lot more too. That can be social determinants of health information, environmental information on their Fitbit. That can be a variety of information that allows for personalized medicine on a level we've never seen it or had it before in the existence of the world. If that data then becomes instantly available for all decision making, the diagnostic and treatment decision making becomes not just personalized, it becomes down to the individual and down to the moment, or I like to say singularized, with respect to how that treatment is optimized for the patient. And within these systems, and Heather can mention in a moment the two pilot, or the two initial rollouts that we've taken our pilots and piled into the right partnerships to be able to put these out there, allowing for patients to have that control, but then also have that compensation in the form of a data marketplace, where much like I could decide when I go to a website which cookies I'm going to allow them to use to track, I can decide which types of data usage by groups, be they government or academic or industry, I allow, and for what compensation they can use my data. And that patient now has the ability to get compensated for the data. They have the ability to give any researcher or any provider access to that data to give them the best possible decision making. And a more advanced application, we can even figure out how to optimize some of the self-informed, self-sovereign, and self-informed decision making that patients can have. Is this the best decision I can make, or can I prompt myself when I know that a reminder to do this healthy thing can keep me away from an emergency room visit that's going to only come in a crisis moment. And so using these data integrity and learning networks with particular populations in particular geographies and with particular communities of interest around a disease model, we think that we can transform in pieces to start, but in interoperability to cross the whole entire nation and the whole entire world, these data integrity learning networks. And Heather, maybe you can, in our last 10 minutes here, talk to our initial partners and our initial focus.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. So the first of our data integrity and learning networks is organized around a particular population with very unique and complex healthcare needs, and needs that many have been striving to meet for a long time, but remain very problematic. And that's veterans and their families in the U.S. market. Veterans have major struggles in transitions of care and uniquely complex requirements regarding which parties are on the hook to pay for different kinds of conditions and circumstances. For example, different when they have injuries from their active duty service and other normal healthcare conditions that emerged for other reasons, and there is ambiguity in coverage and who will deliver that care and what data systems have that data and so on. There's a misunderstanding about veterans and the Veterans Administration, or the VA. People tend to believe, just off the hook, if off the cuff, if they don't know differently, that veterans receive their care from the Veterans Administration. And that's true, but it's only a fairly small percentage of veterans and only for some of their care. The vast majority of veteran care is actually provided by the same healthcare delivery infrastructure that treats the rest of the citizenry. And the intersectionality and complexity between the health plans and the care delivery organizations in the private and public sector, as well as thousands and thousands of charities and foundations seeking to serve veterans, all result in this enormous complexity that has yet to be resolved, especially across organizational boundaries. So, for example, the notion of adjudicating a health claim that might bounce between multiple public and private payers and multiple providers is a perfect example of a multi-party computation executed by smart contracts working with privacy-preserving off-chain data. And that is one example of the heart of what the first of our data integrity and learning networks will achieve. This initiative is called VICI, Veterans Incentivized Coordination and Integration, and it's undertaken proudly in partnership with Dixon Center for Military and Veterans Affairs, Veterans Services. And Dixon Center and ConsenSys Health have come together in order to launch the VICI initiative. And we're very, very proud of that. And you can find press releases on our website about it. Our second major partnership that Sean was alluding to is with the Digital Health Institute for Transformation, another nonprofit partner that is organized around what they call the Smart Community Health Model. And it's a very deep and intricate public health and community health construct in order to address health disparities in vulnerable populations. And together, we are launching what are called HUGs, because all the world needs a hug. HUG stands for Health Utility Grids. And that is a new class of utility, roughly municipally scaled, placed in individual communities as a new utility, like water or power. And that new utility is intended to drive digital inclusion and complete activation into a radically technological society, even for vulnerable populations, even for populations affected by poverty and even homelessness, to be able to be fully included in a radically technological society in a totally digital health environment, and to have representation for the curation, cybersecurity, monetization of their health information in a way that is organized to have no conflict of interest on behalf of the patient, to purely and solely represent the needs of the patient and the community, not the large enterprises and governments seeking to serve them. And in that, we believe we can correct asymmetries of power and representation that are radically needed in communities across the United States and ultimately the world. So health utility grids are a geographically organized data integrity and learning network, and we're going to be launching the first of those later in the 22 calendar year. And VICI is a cohort or population organized data integrity and learning network. But the role of all of these to be interoperable flows from our passion and conviction that the neutral public resource of the Ethereum mainnet can be used as a driver to finally break down the health data silos, and not by running every transaction through mainnet, but through an intricate technological strategy that we believe can finally bridge health data silos.
Incredible. And I have to say, I have a lot of admiration and respect for what both of you are doing. This is extremely courageous, especially in a day and age. It seems like this is something, Sean, you touched on. People are always saying, we'll just take baby steps. Aim for what you can reach right now. And then you talked about the malnutrition of low-hanging fruit. And I think there's so much wisdom in that statement right there. And I think anything great that has ever been accomplished has always been by those who aim high, people who punch upwards, to say the very least. So that is incredible. And a lot of people who watch the show, They're entrepreneurs, tech startups, and the New York City area and in South Florida, but now actually even overseas as well. So what advice would you give to people who are, let's say, trying to do something you both are doing, or just something in the blockchain tech startup space? Because without a doubt, any entrepreneur, any leader I've had on the show, there are always stories, and nothing, things may seem awesome on the surface, especially when the success finally manifests, but you never ever really see all the grit and the sweat that went behind putting up something great, something that's a massive accomplishment.
I have two quick things, and then I'll let Heather have the last word on that. I think number one is the idea of not being afraid of failure. Failure is just lessons learned. Dust yourself off and go again. That's one of the key things. Try and don't even worry about dusting yourself off if you just get up and keep going. And that's absolutely necessary if you want to be safe, and that's okay. Some people focus on they want to do their hobby. They want to spend this aspect of life takes prominence, and they just want their job to be very simple and very cut and dry. They're absolutely critical in this world for lots of people and a lot of different things that are going on. But entrepreneurs are generally not those people, and they're trying to do things differently. And so there you have to not fear failure. The other thing I would say is find the right partners, find the right people to work with. I mean, I left after 20 years in academia and government and tried to start my own business. I found some great partners, but not necessarily what I needed to succeed. And we learned a lot. We did not become a unicorn overnight or anything. But what I did do is I met a lot of other people, and I found a lot of other visions. And Heather in particular had one that aligned with mine and went much further in some of the areas that I did not know well. And so partnering with Heather, partnering with the group that she has pulled together has been absolutely critical for me to take my goals and fit them into a broader set that can be achieved. So finding the right partners that align with vision, and they don't have to be exactly the same. They can be partly aligned and partly not. I view it as your eyes don't see the same things, but together they're binocular vision. And so sometimes you just need people who are close enough, and you're good. So find the right partners.
Thank you, Sean. I think I would add to find your intrinsic motivation in the impact you wish to make at the lifetime level, and think about your own life story. You mentioned the entrepreneur's journey, Adam. Think, and it evokes the hero's journey, of course.
Sure, yeah.
But think about the narrative of your own life as an achievement of the impact that means the most to you, and then never ever lose sight for a moment of the reason why it's worth the fight. The reason why you keep going on the hardest days, because you will get knocked down. You will face resistance. Haters are going to hate. It's going to happen. And to be able to be so resilient that you basically bounce, it means that's the real definition of power. So claim your power, never surrender, and stay connected always to the why. It's worth the fight. And that's very personal to each individual entrepreneur and their colleagues and co-founders and investors who are going to stay in for the long haul. Always stay connected to your purpose, and that North Star will guide you all the way.
Incredible. I don't think there's any other points I can add to that to make this a more perfect episode. So I'll have to end it here. It was an absolute pleasure having you both on. We really got to cover a lot of ground. I'm very excited for this project. I'm very excited with the amount of ambition and drive behind this as well. This is a very, very big thing. And without a doubt, there's going to be a lot of roadblocks and obstacles. And it seems like you both have really the right inner compass for this type of thing, especially something as important as healthcare, life and death. What is more important than life and death? Your own health, the vehicle that takes you everywhere, every moment of your life. I am very excited to see what's around the corner. I'm very excited to see what you all have in store for 2022. And definitely in a few months, I would love to have you both back on and discuss even further some of these things you both have been working on, the projects, and any and all new developments here. So it was an absolute honor and pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on, both of you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Take care. Happy holidays.
You too. Bye.